Thank you, everyone, for coming along today, and thank you for inviting me as well. I'm going to present some work from Ethiopia, from some of the work that myself and colleagues have been involved with, a program that I helped to direct called Better Assistance in Crises. It's called the BASIC program. And I'm from the Institute of Development Studies, and we are collaborating with many others, and I will mention the papers that this research draws on. So, also just to let you know, there are a couple of papers that include all the econometrics and statistics that you can look at. I'm not going to focus a lot on statistics, I'm going to focus more on storytelling and some diagrams. So a bit of background for our research. We know that armed conflict is really a big increasingly pressing issue globally. We also know that progress in poverty reduction is increasingly attributed to sort of the new development agenda, social protection. When I first started working on social protection 23 years ago, it was really a very novel term. And actually, we thought for a while it was just going to be a little bit of 5 years, but it's actually got so massive, it's almost like its own development paradigm. When we think about sort of emergencies, humanitarian conflict, we know that it's particularly difficult for the state and others to continue providing assistance in violent conflicts. There's plenty of evidence that shows because of disruptions around logistical and around institutional capacity, around damage and destruction, around trust, all sorts of tensions and damage that occurs during conflict that is very difficult to continue programming, particularly long-term social protection programs. So we know all this, but little is known about how conflict interacts particularly and disrupts social assistance, how social assistance protects households during a conflict and after conflict, and also what do we know about whether non-state humanitarian providers, do they actually substitute for longer-term governance, sort of longer-term social safety nets? Is there some kind of complementarity between those two things? So that's what our research in total looks at. I can't look at it all now because we've only got 10 minutes. But I just want you to say that to let you know that the two papers what I'm talking about today, the two papers that I'm drawing on are these two. And a couple of my co-authors are in the room. So I'm going to focus primarily on the second, but I'm going to draw on both of them. They both actually point in similar directions. So the questions that we're asking in the research, the main question is, does social assistance, and that can be social protection, social assistance and humanitarian assistance, I'm including them both there. Definitionally, we can have that discussion if you like. But does social assistance mitigate the impacts of conflict-related shocks, and how does it do that? So 3 sub-questions we ask is, how does conflict influence food security and poverty outcomes, a whole range of outcomes? And both papers look at that. We've got one paper 1 is actually on a cash plus intervention, and does that protect against adverse effects of conflict, that plus element? And then thirdly, are there complementarities between social and humanitarian assistance during and after a conflict? And that's the one I'm really going to focus most on now. So where did we do this research? We did it in Amhara. Amhara is a region of Ethiopia that borders Tigray. Tigray, if you will remember, there was a big conflict there in 2020. And that conflict, as it progressed, it spilled over into the neighboring region of Amhara. And that spilled over in 2021. And due to that, there was 5 million in need of assistance, and there was over 500,000 displaced. Also, other shocks happening at the time. It's very much an area of multiple shocks, enduring climate shocks. In fact, this region is the heartland of the 1980s famine, and there's always been drought shocks happening there. In 2015, there was a severe drought also. And just also to give you the landscape of social assistance, some of you who will know about Ethiopia, there's a big productive safety net program that covers this region. It's a government-run, but also donor-supported and funded program. And humanitarian aid and assistance is also available in this region. And the caseload for humanitarian assistance spiked to about 16 million in 2023. So that gives you a sense of where we were working. In terms of our methods, we had a panel survey. The first survey was done in March. Well, actually, it goes a lot further back, but for this research, we were just looking at 2 points. IFPRI were very nice in letting us access their data from a survey in 21, and the conflict happened later that year, and we resurveyed those people with a bespoke survey that we added a lot of conflict questions to in 2022. So we had that panel survey going on. I don't need to read all the details out, but we had a sample of 1,000 households. There's also qualitative work that complements this, and you'll hear about that in a session on Wednesday morning. One of my co-authors is also presenting separate work on this. So the impacts of the conflict, as we would imagine, are very severe, very severe. There was disruption to agricultural production. There was large-scale asset losses. 28% of those we interviewed had consumer durables stolen or destroyed. Productive assets were destroyed. And we also had a large substantial income reductions because of the conflict. And in terms of our regression analysis, we were looking at conflict intensity using ACLED data, and we showed that that's highly correlated with an increased likelihood of displacement, sending one's children away when the conflict was higher, and reducing market visits. And it was also negatively associated with nearly all outcome indicators, such as food, security, consumption. So the higher the conflict intensity, the worse impacts it had on these indicators. So that's what we would expect, of course. So I'm going to focus, and we see that in both the papers I was discussing, really strong impacts of conflict. So we were interested, as I said, the paper I'm looking at, are there complementarities between social and humanitarian assistance? So as social assistance, particularly from the government, gets disrupted, do we see humanitarian aid substituting for that? Was there and often we only look, particularly in conflict and shock context, we only look at one type of assistance. We don't look at complementarities or substitutes between assistant types. So before the conflict, all the households in our sample were receiving the safety net program, and some had a little bit of humanitarian support in terms of idiosyncratic shocks. After the conflict, because of various retargeting exercises, 50% of our sample approximately did no longer access the big productive safety net. So we had a sample that did not have that, the social safety net program. So we were able to look at what was happening in terms of their access to and to different types of assistance. So over this period, we see an increase in the number of times households are receiving humanitarian aid, and we see a significant shift. So I just want to show this diagrammatically. So in terms of the complementarities of the productive safety net and humanitarian aid, if we just look at this side first, the green line is showing 2021, before the conflict happened. There was very little instances of humanitarian aid. As conflict intensity increased, there wasn't much conflict, there wasn't much humanitarian aid. 2022 is after the conflict, and we see there's a lot more instances of humanitarian aid overall, but also as conflict intensity increases, we see more people going for humanitarian aid. Well, that's a good thing. At least targeting of humanitarian aid looks quite good. Now, if you look over there, you see on the bottom the months that somebody is on a productive safety net program. So going along the horizontal. And then going up the vertical is the amount of times, the same as this side, that people are going for humanitarian support. And it's really nice to see, it's encouraging to see that so the green is before the conflict, the blue is after the conflict. You see that those people who are on the government safety net program for the longest months, are less likely to have humanitarian aid. Those who have 0 months of the productive safety net are much more likely to have humanitarian. Now, that's a nice complementarity. We don't usually see that because people don't often collect data from the different sources. So you see there's a dynamic between the different kinds of assistance. which is a good thing. Now, the other thing we looked at, which was more complex, there's a lot of econometrics to go with it in the papers, we looked at the mix of social assistance and humanitarian assistance over this period. And so we had 4 categories. Some people had little to no support from either or both over the period. Some had relatively high humanitarian aid, little safety net, others relatively high safety net, little aid, and some households accessed both in quite high levels, not at the same time, but at different times over that period. And so the main sort of take-home picture, I think, for us is this. So you'll just have to bear with me a little bit. The overall, we've got a downward slope. As conflict intensifies, you get this on the vertical is consumption expenditure. You have lower consumption expenditure. And we looked at various outcomes. We looked at calories, we looked at food insecurity, we looked at poverty rates. And you see that, of course, as conflict intensifies, you get worse outcomes. However, when you look at the case of those who are on high humanitarian aid and high safety net, that's the dark blue. It's the one with the least steep slope. As conflict intensifies in areas with higher conflict intensity, you see that having a higher amount of social and humanitarian assistance has a protective effect. Yes, there's a little bit of a negative slope, but it provides a buffer against the conflict intensity. So having that support, so the green line coming down is when you've got no or little support. There's hardly any, there's no protection. But you see that with any sort of type of support, particularly both together that are complementing each other, there's a really good protected buffering that happens. How are you doing? I was expecting this. Oh, I've got 0. I didn't hear the alarm go.
Sorry.
Okay, I've got one slide left. So conflict, so just to finalize, conflict intensity significantly and negatively impacts poverty and food security outcomes. We know that, that's pretty straightforward, it's intuitive. Social assistance provides a protective function, but there's no evidence of promotive outcomes. So for example, we see, when you look at the papers and look at this story, that social protection protects households in terms of their food, but when you start looking at assets, in fact, you don't see any impacts on that at all. Sometimes are negative. So it does. Often social protection is supposed to provide promotive resilience aspects, but we don't see that. But it has a really good protective function. Finally, I think it's really important that to look at different types of assistance and how they interact is really an important takeaway from this, because if we'd only looked at the safety net on its own, we wouldn't have had the same story as when the fact that when during a conflict or during any crisis, households can move between forms of support, and if we can try and help build complementarities between those types of support, we're going to have a much better outcome for saving lives and livelihoods. So I'll leave it there because I've run out of time, but please do look at our papers if you're interested.